For most of its existence, the WNBA survived on a simple premise. The league existed, the games were played, and that was supposed to be enough. Players were told the business was fragile, salaries were low, conditions were modest, and if anyone pushed back, the answer was always the same. The money just wasn't there yet. Then the money arrived, and it changed everything. In the summer of 2024, the WNBA announced a new media rights agreement worth $2.2 billion over 11 years. The partners were Disney, Amazon, and NBC Universal. The average annual payout, $200 million, represented roughly a six-fold increase over what the league had been earning before. For a league that had spent nearly 3 decades arguing its worth to the sports business world, it was the kind of number that doesn't just shift the conversation. It ends one era and starts another. But here is what made that moment genuinely significant. The day after the WNBA wrapped its most successful season in history, record attendance, record ratings, the New York Liberty winning their first championship, the Players' Union announced that it was opting out of the existing collective bargaining agreement. They didn't wait. They didn't celebrate. They moved. That sequence tells you everything about where women's basketball stands right now. The WNBA is not simply enjoying a moment of growth. It is entering a structural inflection point where the rules around money, labor, and ownership are being challenged at every level simultaneously. And the outcome of that challenge will determine not just how much players get paid, but who actually controls the upside of one of the fastest growing businesses in professional sports. To understand why this moment is different from every previous moment of optimism in the WNBA's history, you have to start with the numbers that existed before the new deal arrived. In 2025, the WNBA salary cap for an entire team stood at $1.5 million. The minimum salary was $66,000. The Supermax, the highest salary the league's best players could earn, was $249,000. Those numbers did not belong to a league generating hundreds of millions in revenue. They belonged to a survival-era business model that had simply never been updated to reflect what the product had become. For years, WNBA players supplemented their incomes by playing overseas in the off-season, in Turkey, Russia, China, and across Europe. This was treated as a normal, even expected part of a professional career in women's basketball. The best players in the world routinely earned more in a few months abroad than they made in an entire American season. The league existed, but financially it had never asked to be taken seriously. What changed was not just the media deal. What changed was the context around it. The 2024 WNBA season saw attendance grow significantly league-wide. Television ratings hit levels the league had never seen before. Multiple players became genuine national figures with endorsement portfolios, social media audiences, and commercial profiles that extended well beyond basketball. The business case for women's basketball was no longer theoretical. It was producing real, measurable, growing revenue. And the players who built that product decided they were no longer willing to operate under terms designed for a different era. When the Players' Union announced its opt-out, WNBPA President Nneka Ogwumike put it plainly, opting out isn't just about bigger paychecks. It's about claiming our rightful share of the business we've built. That framing is important. The players were not simply asking for raises. They were raising a structural question about how value is distributed in a league that had been using a labor model built for scarcity, now operating in a world of growth. The union's core demand was not just higher salaries. It was the transformation of the system itself. The existing CBA imposed what players described as arbitrary and restrictive caps on the value and benefits they could receive. What the union wanted was an equity-based model, one that grows alongside the business rather than staying fixed at levels negotiated when the business was worth far less. That is a fundamentally different kind of demand. It is not a negotiation over price. It is a negotiation over structure. The distance between those two things matters. When you negotiate over price, you are accepting the existing framework and arguing about how much you get paid within it. When you negotiate over structure, you are challenging who has leverage, who captures growth, and how future value gets divided. The players were doing the second thing, and the new media deal had given them the ammunition to make that argument at a scale they had never had before. The 11-year deal with Disney, Amazon, and NBC Universal was not just a revenue upgrade. It was a proof of value. $2.2 billion committed by 3 of the largest media companies in the world is not a charitable gesture. It is a commercial judgment. It says that rights holders believe the WNBA audience will be large, loyal, and valuable enough over more than a decade to justify that investment. And if that commercial judgment is accurate, then the question of what the players who produce that product should earn becomes very difficult to answer with numbers from 2020. The negotiations that followed the opt-out stretched through the 2025 season and into early 2026. In March 2026, the WNBA and the Players Union reached an agreement in principle on a new collective bargaining agreement. And the shift in numbers was not incremental, it was structural. The salary cap jumped from $1.5 million in 2025 to $7 million in 2026, a fourfold increase in a single year. The minimum salary moved from $66,000 to between $270,000 and $300,000, depending on years of service. The Supermax starting salary rose from $249,000 to $1.4 million. The average salary across the league went from approximately $120,000 to around $600,000, and the cap is projected to exceed $10 million before the agreement ends. Players would also receive close to 20% of league and team revenue, up from roughly 9% under the prior deal. These are not adjustments. They are a fundamental repricing of labor in women's professional basketball, and they happened because the business conditions finally made the old numbers impossible to defend. But the new CBA did not arrive in a vacuum. While the WNBA and its union spent more than a year negotiating, something else was happening in the broader landscape of women's basketball, something that changed the pressure dynamics in ways that went beyond a typical labor dispute. In the winter of 2025, a new league called Unrivaled held its inaugural season. It was co-founded by WNBA players Nafisa Collier and Brianna Stewart, two of the most accomplished players in the league's history. The format was 3-on-3 basketball, played in a single arena in Miami during the WNBA offseason. The structure was deliberately player-centered from the start. Players received equity in the league. Salaries were significantly higher than WNBA standards. And the entire operation was built around the premise that women's basketball players, operating in a model designed for them rather than around them, would generate a compelling product. What happened next was not subtle. Unrivaled outperformed its own financial projections in its first year, generating $27 million in revenue during a single 10-week season. Viewership numbers beat expectations. Player demand for roster spots exceeded available space. And in September 2025, the league completed an oversubscribed Series B funding round led by Bessemer Venture Partners, with Serena Williams' investment firm, Warner Bros. Discovery, and other backers joining. The result? A valuation of $340 million, up from $95 million just a year earlier. The league then announced it was expanding from 6 to 8 teams, a year ahead of its original schedule. To put that valuation in context, Unrivaled reached $340 million as a young, experimental, 10-week, 3-on-3 off-season league. That number needs to sit with you for a moment. Paige Bueckers made that contrast impossible to ignore. Bueckers entered the 2025 WNBA draft as the consensus number 1 overall pick, the most anticipated women's basketball prospect in years. Under the existing WNBA rookie scale, she was set to earn $78,000 in her first year. Her entire 4-year WNBA rookie contract was worth approximately $348,000 total. Before her WNBA career even began, she signed a deal with Unrivaled for her debut season that would pay her more than $350,000 in a single 10-week period, more than the entire value of her 4-year WNBA contract, in one offseason at a smaller league, playing 3-on-3 basketball. That comparison did not go unnoticed. It was not just a striking statistic, it was a structural argument, delivered in numbers. It said something definitive about where WNBA player compensation had been set relative to the market's actual assessment of these players' commercial value. Unrivaled and the WNBA are not the same kind of organization, and that distinction matters for understanding why one league could move so much faster than the other. The WNBA is an established institution with nearly 30 years of history, a growing network of franchises, long-term television partnerships, and an expanding footprint that now includes teams in cities like Toronto, Portland, Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia, with expansion fees that rose from $50 million to $250 million, between 2024 and 2025. The WNBA has institutional scale, NBA infrastructure and support, and the kind of market credibility that takes decades to build. Unrivaled has none of that history, but it has speed. And in a labor negotiation, speed matters. As a single entity structure, meaning the league itself centrally operates without the same multi-party franchise system, Unrivaled can offer equity directly to players and restructure its compensation model without the kind of complex multi-stakeholder negotiation that governs a franchise league. That structural difference allowed Unrivaled to do in its first year what the WNBA had been debating for years: build a model where players are not just employees, but stakeholders. That difference created external pressure on the WNBA's negotiating position in a way that had never existed before. In every previous labor negotiation in the league's history, the WNBA was effectively the only serious professional option for women's basketball players in America during the off-season. Players could go overseas, but they couldn't stay home and earn more. Unrivaled changed that calculation. It gave the best players in the world a domestic alternative with higher pay, ownership stakes, and a structure built around their interests. And it did this in the off-season, a window the WNBA had previously been able to treat as leverage-free territory. The existence of an alternative is one of the oldest and most powerful forces in any labor market. When workers have nowhere else to go, the terms they receive tend to reflect that absence of choice. When alternatives emerge, the negotiating dynamic shifts. The WNBA Players Union understood this, and the timing of the opt-out, announced immediately after the most successful season in league history, with Unrivaled already operational, was not coincidental. The expansion numbers tell a complementary story. When the Golden State Valkyries joined the WNBA in 2025, the expansion fee was $50 million. When Toronto and Portland were admitted, fees ranged between $50 and $75 million. By mid-2025, when Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia were announced, the expansion fee had reached $250 million per team, 5 times higher in roughly 1 year. That acceleration does not happen in a stagnant business. It happens when buyers believe the future value of an asset is significantly higher than its current price, and they want to get in before it becomes even more expensive. 3 new teams at $250 million each represent $750 million of new capital flowing into the WNBA's franchise structure in a single announcement. That money reflects external market confidence in the league's trajectory. And external market confidence, expressed at that scale, is the kind of signal that makes the old arguments about financial constraints very difficult to sustain at the bargaining table. The new CBA that emerged in early 2026 reflects all of this pressure converging at once. The salary increases are historic. The revenue-sharing structure is fundamentally different. The cap trajectory suggests that by the end of the 7-year deal, the economic profile of playing in the WNBA will bear almost no resemblance to what it looked like in 2025, let alone 2020. Players who spent their careers being told the league couldn't afford to pay them fairly are now operating under a framework that, at least in its structure, acknowledges what the business has actually become. But it would be too simple to read that outcome as a resolution. What the new CBA actually represents is the first round of a much longer negotiation over who owns the growth of women's basketball. The players won significant gains. But the fundamental question, how the upside of a rapidly appreciating business gets divided between labor and ownership, doesn't get answered in one contract cycle. It gets answered over time, as the commercial stakes keep rising and the leverage on both sides continues to evolve. Unrivaled's trajectory is part of that answer. A league that started at a $95 million valuation in late 2024 and reached $340 million by September 2025 is not standing still. Its expansion, its player equity model, and its ability to attract major institutional investors suggest that the off-season alternative it represents will only become more significant as its business grows. The pressure it exerts on the WNBA's labor model will only intensify if it continues to offer players a structural deal that a franchise system cannot easily replicate. What we are watching is not simply a league getting bigger. We are watching the emergence of a competitive market for women's basketball labor. One where players have options, where alternatives exist, and where the terms of compensation are being reset by forces that include, but extend well beyond what happens inside a single collective bargaining negotiation. The WNBA's story for the next decade is not really about whether the games will be popular. The ratings and the attendance and the expansion fees have already answered that question. The real story is about structure. It is about whether a league that spent nearly 30 years operating under scarcity-era economics can successfully transition into a growth-era model where players are treated as the primary commercial asset rather than a manageable cost. The new CBA moves in that direction. But the gap between what players are now earning and what they arguably generate will remain a live question, and the Players' Union has already built the infrastructure and the precedent to keep pushing. The WNBA's franchise owners, many of them connected to NBA ownership groups that have spent decades navigating the relationship between league revenue and player compensation, know how this kind of negotiation develops over time. The upside keeps growing, the leverage keeps shifting, and the parties who secured favorable structural terms early tend to hold them longer. The real question at the center of all of this is the same one it has always been in every significant sports labor moment. Not, is the league growing? The answer is clear. Not, were the players underpaid? The new CBA partially answers that. The real question is, when a sports business transitions from surviving to genuinely thriving, who captures the value of that transformation? The WNBA has reached the moment when that question can no longer be deferred, dismissed, or answered with promises about future growth. The future growth arrived. The media companies paid $2.2 billion to prove it. The expansion teams paid $250 million each to confirm it. And the players, for the first time in the league's history, walked into a negotiating room with real leverage and a real alternative, and used both. Women's basketball spent a long time asking to be taken seriously as a business. The money finally said yes. Now the only question left is who gets to sit at the table when the profits are divided. And that question, it turns out, is a much harder negotiation than anything that came before it.